I've always been the kind of person who keeps a calendar for everyone else. My sister's dentist appointment, my dad's medication refill schedule, my brother-in-law's work travel dates. I had them all saved, color-coded, in my phone. I never missed a birthday. I never forgot a pickup time. I was the person my family called when they needed something done. And I did it without thinking twice. Because that's who I thought I was supposed to be. What I didn't realize, until the autumn I turned 31 and ended up alone in a hospital recovery room in Mississauga, was that the calendar only ever went one way. My diagnosis had come 8 months before the surgery. Nothing that would kill me immediately, but nothing to ignore either. Endometriosis severe enough that my gynecologist in Hamilton said we were past the point of managing it with medication. She referred me to a specialist, and by February I had a date on the books, October 14th. A laparoscopic procedure. Day surgery, technically, but I'd need someone to drive me home and stay with me for at least 48 hours afterward, because of the general anesthesia and the pain management protocol. I'd also need help, for roughly 2 weeks, getting to follow-up appointments and physical therapy. I told my family at Easter dinner. We were all at my parents' house in Burlington, the whole group of us. My parents, my older sister and her husband, my younger brother and his girlfriend. I explained the diagnosis slowly, made sure everyone understood it wasn't cancer, but that it was serious, and that the surgery was scheduled for October. My mom squeezed my hand across the table and said, "Oh, sweetheart, we'll be there." My dad nodded without looking up from his plate. My sister asked what kind of recovery I was looking at. Said 2 weeks, maybe 3. Her husband looked at her, she looked at him. A whole conversation passed between them in about 3 seconds. "That should be fine," she said. "October's usually pretty open for us." I went home that night feeling okay. Scared about the surgery, but okay about not being alone. What I didn't know, what nobody mentioned at Easter dinner, was that my sister and her husband had already booked a trip to Whistler for Thanksgiving weekend. They'd put the deposit down in January. My surgery was scheduled for the Tuesday after Thanksgiving Monday. They would be back Sunday night, technically. But Sunday night, after a long weekend of skiing and flights and bags to unpack, is not the same as being there. I found out about the trip in August. Not from my sister directly. From my brother, who mentioned it casually while we were grabbing coffee. The way you mention something you assume everyone already knows. "Is this still about the surgery?" I asked. "Because she said she'd be there." He looked uncomfortable. "She's back Sunday. The surgery isn't until Tuesday. She knows I need someone at the hospital. She knows I can't drive myself home." He stirred his coffee for a long time. "I'm sure she'll figure something out." I called my sister that night. She was calm and reasonable in the way she always is when she's already decided something. She said the trip had been planned for 9 months. She said she would be back before the surgery. She said her husband had already taken the time off work, their dog was already booked at the kennel, and the flights were non-refundable. "But I told you about this at Easter," I said. "You told us the surgery was in October. We didn't know the exact date until June. I told you the exact date in June." She was quiet for a moment. I didn't think it would overlap this much. I asked about my parents. She said my dad had his own health things going on. Which was true. He'd been dealing with a recurring knee issue, and had a physio appointment that week, and my mom didn't like driving on the highway by herself, especially not to Mississauga. I said I would really appreciate it if someone could be there. She said she understood, and that she was sorry, and that she would talk to Mom. She didn't call me back for 5 days. When she did, she said that after thinking about it, she didn't think she could cancel the trip at this point. The refund window had passed. Her husband was really looking forward to it. She said she hoped I understood. I said yes. I said I understood. I sat on my kitchen floor after I hung up and cried for a long time. Not loud crying, the quiet kind. The only person I hadn't really updated was my grandfather on my mother's side. He was 81, lived alone since my grandmother passed, in a townhouse in Oakville, and he was, how do I describe him? He was the person in our family who had always been there so steadily that you almost stopped registering his presence the way you stop registering a load-bearing wall. He drove himself everywhere. He went to his Legion branch every Thursday. He still did his own grocery shopping and his own taxes. I called him not because I expected anything, but because I'd been putting it off and felt guilty. He knew about the diagnosis. He'd asked careful, specific questions when I told him back in the spring. He wanted to understand what endometriosis actually was, asked me to spell it so he could look it up later, asked about the recovery timeline, asked whether the surgeon had done many of these procedures. When I told him the family was going to Whistler and my parents weren't planning to be there, I tried to keep my voice even. I said I was figuring out a plan. Maybe a friend from work could drive me. I had options. He was quiet on the line for a few seconds. Then he said, "What time do you need to be at the hospital?" 6:30 in the morning. "But you don't have to. I'll be at your place at 5:05, he said. "I know where the hospital is. I've had procedures there, Grandpa." 5:45, he said again, gently but with finality. "Do you want me to bring anything? I can stop at Tim's on the way." I cried again after we hung up. Different kind of crying this time. He was at my door at 5:43 holding 2 large coffees. He was wearing his good coat, the navy wool one he'd had for 20 years, and he had a small notebook in his breast pocket. I asked about the notebook. He said he was going to write down everything the nurses told him, so I wouldn't have to try to remember it later. He sat in that waiting room for 4 hours. He's 81 years old, and he sat in a plastic hospital chair for 4 hours, and when they let him come back to recovery, the first thing he said to me was, "The surgeon came out and said everything went well." I wrote down everything she said. He showed me the notebook. 3 pages, front and back, in his small careful handwriting. Medication names, follow-up dates, what to watch for, when to call, what normal recovery looked like versus what was a concern. I looked at those 3 pages and thought about how nobody else had even asked for the surgeon's name. He drove me home. He stayed in my spare room for the first 2 nights. He went to the pharmacy and picked up my prescriptions. He made me soup, not from a can, actual soup, the kind with a bone in it that takes all afternoon. And he watched the evening news in my living room and didn't talk too much, which was exactly right, because I didn't have the energy to talk. My sister texted from Whistler, a photo of a mountain. "Thinking of you? Hope it went okay." My mom called the evening after surgery, while Grandpa was in the kitchen doing my dishes. She asked how I was feeling. I said sore and tired. She asked if I had everything I needed. I said yes, Grandpa was here. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Oh, that's good. I'm glad someone was able to be there. I'm glad someone was able to be there." I thought about that sentence for a long time after. My dad texted 3 days later. "Heard the surgery was fine. Feel better soon." That was it. My brother called and was genuinely kind. Actually, he felt bad, I could tell, and he asked real questions and offered to come over that weekend. He did come, on the Saturday, and he brought me a bag of clementines and a card, and he helped Grandpa move my couch so I could get to the bathroom more easily. I don't want to paint my whole family with the same brush. My brother was trying. But my sister and her husband came home from Whistler on the Sunday, and she texted me that she was exhausted from travel and would call me that week. She called on Wednesday. She asked how I was feeling. I said I was still in pain, and the physiotherapy referral had come through. She said that was great, and then she told me about a restaurant in Whistler they'd tried that I would apparently love, and then her husband came home and she said she had to go. She never asked about the surgery itself. She never asked what it felt like to wake up alone in recovery. She never asked if I was scared. She just moved on, the way you move on from something that didn't really involve you. Grandpa came with me to my first follow-up appointment, and my second. He drove me to my first physio session and waited in the car with a crossword puzzle. On the drive home, he asked the physio what exercises I was supposed to do, and she wrote them down for him, and he kept the paper on his refrigerator and asked me about them every time I called. Meanwhile, I started to notice things I'd let myself not notice for years. When my sister had her second baby, my mother stayed with her for 3 weeks. She drove 40 minutes each way, every single day. She cooked, she cleaned, she did the older child's school pickup. When I had my appendix out 6 years ago, before all of this, my mother hadn't been able to come because the baby had a cold, and I'd recovered alone in my apartment and told myself it was fine. It was only an appendectomy. I was 25 and capable. When my brother-in-law got a promotion last year, my parents took the whole family out to a restaurant downtown that cost probably $300 for the evening. When I got promoted to senior project coordinator at my company, my dad said, "Good for you," and my mom asked if that meant more hours. I started remembering 100 small moments I'd filed away under "that's just how it is." The Christmas I didn't get a gift from my sister because she'd forgotten to pack mine when they drove down from Barrie. The time my parents gave her kids respite a top-up and told me about it afterward, a little sheepishly, saying they'd do the same for my kids someday. The time my mom spent 4 hours on a Saturday helping my sister reorganize her home office, and I couldn't get her on the phone to talk through a work situation that was genuinely stressing me out. None of those things were huge. That's the thing about favoritism in a family. It's almost never one catastrophic moment. It's the weight of 100 small moments that you're not supposed to name out loud, because saying it makes you sound like you're keeping score. I wasn't keeping score. Grandpa was. I didn't know that at the time. He told me later, much later, that it had started long before October. He said he'd been watching for years, noticing the way attention moved in our family, the way certain people's events got treated as occasions, and other people's events got treated as obligations. He said he'd had conversations with my mother about it, gentle ones, and the conversations had gone nowhere. He said he'd hoped things would shift on their own. When he sat in that hospital waiting room in October, he said, something settled in him. He'd brought his notebook to write down medical information, and he did write down medical information. But he also started writing down other things. He wrote down the texts my sister sent me from Whistler. He asked me, over those 2 weeks, to read him my family's messages so he could respond to my mom's calls while I rested. And I did, and he wrote down what they said. He tracked who called, who didn't, what was asked, what wasn't. He wasn't planning to use any of it. Not at first. He said he just needed to see it clearly, on paper, outside of his own head, to know that he wasn't imagining things. What made him decide to act was my sister's Christmas plan. My parents have a party every December. Not a huge event, maybe 20 people, close family, and a few old friends. And it's been happening for as long as I can remember. My mom loves it. It's the ten she genuinely pours herself into, every year. In November, my sister called a family group chat discussion about the party. She thought it would be lovely if we did a big family accomplishment feature this year. She'd gotten a promotion. Her husband had finished his MBA. Her older kid had placed in a regional swim meet. She suggested a little slideshow. Something to celebrate the family's year. Nobody mentioned my surgery. Nobody mentioned my recovery. Nobody mentioned that I'd spent 3 weeks in pain working from home, while managing my own medical appointments, that I'd had to arrange my own ride, that I'd navigated the Ontario Disability Support Forms, and the insurance paperwork alone. It wasn't malicious. That's almost the worst part. It was just. I wasn't part of the picture they were painting of the year. Grandpa called me after that group chat. He asked me how I felt about it. I said I was fine, it wasn't a big deal. He was quiet for a moment. I'd like to say something at the party, he said. Grandpa, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. I want to. I told him I didn't want him to make a scene. He said it wouldn't be a scene. He said he had something he wanted to share with the family, and he thought the party would be a good time. He wouldn't tell me exactly what he was planning. He just said, trust me. I didn't love that, but I trusted him, more than I'd trusted anyone that year. The party was on a Saturday evening, mid-December. My parents' house was warm and smelled like my mom's shortbread, which she makes every year, and everyone was in a good mood. My sister's kids ran through the living room. My brother-in-law opened a nice bottle of wine. My dad had new Christmas lights on the front of the house and was very pleased about them. My sister did her slideshow. It was nice, genuinely. She'd put effort into it, had photos, a cheerful font. Everyone clapped for the swim meet placement. Everyone toasted the MBA. Then Grandpa stood up. He does this thing when he's about to say something important. He straightens himself to his full height, and he clears his throat once, quietly. He's not a tall man, but he has a presence, the kind that comes from decades of being someone people can count on. The room got quiet without him having to ask. He said he also wanted to share something about the family's year. He said he'd been keeping some notes, and he hoped everyone would indulge him for a few minutes. He opened his notebook. He talked about October 14th. He described arriving at my apartment at 5:43 in the morning. He read out, from his notes, the exact text my sister had sent from Whistler. The mountain photo, the 3 exclamation points. He read out the 3-day gap before my dad's text. He read out my mother's words verbatim. I'm glad someone was able to be there. He didn't say those things with anger. That's what I need you to understand. He said them quietly, factually, the way you read a document into a record. He said he was sharing this not to embarrass anyone but because he'd watched a pattern in this family for a long time, and he loved everyone in this room too much to keep watching it. He talked about my sister's home office afternoon versus the phone call I couldn't get answered. He talked about the resp top-up and the promotion dinner that never happened. He was specific, he was thorough, he had dates. My sister's husband made a noise, something dismissive. Dad, you're overreacting, directed at Grandpa. And Grandpa looked at him calmly and said, the problem isn't what I'm saying. The problem is that I can back it up. The room stayed quiet for a long time after that. My mom was crying. She wasn't angry crying. She was the kind of crying that means something has landed somewhere real. My dad was looking at the floor. My sister had gone very still. My brother caught my eye from across the room. He nodded at me once, slowly. He already knew. He'd been watching too, and hadn't known how to name it any better than I had. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because I think it's important. There wasn't a dramatic confession. My sister didn't throw her arms around me and sob. My parents didn't make a speech. What happened was quieter than that, and I think more real. My mom came and sat beside me on the couch and held my hand and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't realize how much of this you were carrying by yourself," and I believed her. I don't think she'd been deliberately cruel. I think she'd taken me for granted in the way you can take someone for granted when they never complain, when they always manage, when they make it easy for you to believe they don't need much. My sister didn't talk to me directly that night. She took her kids home early. She called me the following Tuesday, and it was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. She cried, which surprised me, and she said things I'd waited years to hear. She said she knew I'd always been the one who held everything together. She said she'd let herself believe that meant I was fine. We're not fixed. I want to be clear about that too. Families don't fix themselves in one evening. But something shifted. Some unspoken agreement we'd all been honoring. Some arrangement where my needs were optional and everyone else's were urgent. It cracked open, and light came in through the crack. Grandpa drove me home from the party. It was cold, a hard December cold, and his car took a minute to warm up. We sat in the driveway while the heat came on, and I asked him what he'd written in the notebook between October and December, all those weeks. He handed it to me. I read it in the glow of the streetlight. Dates, messages, details, his handwriting, careful and small. At the bottom of the last page he'd written, "She deserves to be in the picture." I gave the notebook back to him. He put it in his breast pocket, the same pocket he always keeps it in. "I've watched you take care of everyone in this family for 30 years, he said, "and it was time someone took care of you." He said it simply, the way he says most things, and I sat with it all the way home, that sentence, turning it over. I think about it still. Especially on the days when old habits kick in and I catch myself about to add someone else's appointment to my calendar. About to arrange something, solve something, hold something together without being asked. I've gotten better at pausing before I do that. At asking myself whether the care I give is going anywhere. At choosing sometimes to let the calendar be a little less full. I still drive out to Oakville every other Sunday. We watch the game. He's a Leafs fan. I've been dragged along for years. And I bring the Tim Hortons this time, and sometimes I bring food from home. Nothing fancy, just something warm. He always acts surprised. He never is. He's 81, and he's the person who showed me that being taken for granted is only permanent if you allow it to be. That the loudest love isn't always the love that counts. That sometimes the person who has been watching the longest is the one who finally decides to speak. I used to think my job in this family was to keep everything running smoothly. To be the one who remembered everything, needed nothing, and never made anyone uncomfortable by asking. I know better now. I'm the kind of person who keeps a calendar, yes. But these days I make sure my name is on it too.